Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. My name is Peter, and I help direct the events here at Strand. For a little bit of history, the Strand was founded in 1927 by the Bass family over on what was then 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled until after over 92 years, Strand is the sole survivor, still housing new and used books, running 400 events a year, and still run by the Bass family. Tonight, I am thrilled as a lifelong fan of Charles Schulz and his creation to be welcoming a celebration of the Peanuts papers, a brand new collection of writing on the meanings and influences of Charlie Brown, Snoopy, and all the rest in our lives. Here with us tonight are Andrew Blauner, founder of Blauner Books, a literary agency and editor of the Peanuts papers, along with 6 other anthologies. Adam Gopnik, staff writer at The New Yorker, where he's written since 1986, earning 3 National Magazine Awards, a George Polk Award, and the Medal of the Chevalier of the Order of Arts and Letters. And Mona Simpson, award-winning novelist and writer of numerous short stories, including Jackpot, which floored me in the latest N+1 issue, Wrong Object, included in the most recent edition of Best American Short Stories, and many others. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming them to the Strand.
So thank you for that introduction, and thank you to Library of America, which is the publisher of this book. And as I always say, is not just a publisher, but is a cultural institution which deserves everybody's attention and support. So I encourage you to take note of that. It seems appropriate. Is this working? Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. Okay. It's apropos in a way to have a celebration of a book about the world's greatest, a comic strip at the world's greatest, arguably the world's greatest bookstore. When I was in my 30s, I moved down the block here thinking I would come here every day, go to Baltimore, go to Japonica, and because I had a crush on a woman who lived there. I went to Japonica once because you could never get in. I bowled once. I never saw the girl, but I came to this event.
So my literary agency.
The last time I was here for an event was for another anthology, the Central Park anthology, which Adam has contributed to. But the last anthology that I did before this one was called In Their Lives, and it was about the Beatles. And both Mona and Adam contributed to that book, which I realized is not just a coincidence, but it's kind of an entry point, I think, because there's something. I remember when we did the Beatles book tour, we were talking about, are we in the middle of a Beatles moment? Because there were all these anniversaries coming up, and Channel and everything. And so too with Peanuts, which, not to delude you with too much history, but it started in 1950, ran for 50 years until 2000. Charles Schulz died in 2000, so there hasn't been a new strip since for 20 years. And yet here we are, and I think a week from Friday, Apple TV is launching Peanuts channel. I think at the Thanksgiving Day parade, there's going to be a new Snoopy float. And this is a fascinating subject to me. The most produced musical in American theater history is You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown. And I asked my wife, who's a theater producer, how do they quantify this? And because you need permissions and rights, and so because it's a lot of junior high shows. And so the number, if you had to guess, I mean, I'm almost as blown away by this as to know that there are 400,000 new books published every year. The number of productions of Your Good Man, Charlie Brown is over 40,000. And it has employed, per se, over 250,000. And yet, there's a new national tour that's starting this January. So all of which is to say, I do want to get into the specific pieces that you wrote, but I want to start by asking each of you, is this a moment, or has this been just sort of a 50-year, 70-year moment? How do you explain the transcendence, the resonance, the endurance of Peanuts?
That's a hard one. I think to me, it's hard to answer that completely because sort of for that 50-year period, the second part of the 20th century, when, Schulz produced all his strips, really, he was the one I liked. He was really the one I liked. And I don't think as a female, I'm that atypical. I think I remember my cousins at home, I think now there's been a kind of explosion in the world of graphic novels and comics of the whole genre. Exploded, but that was really the only kind of completely humanistic, accessible to everyone, thing that was even on the front page. You know, so, and I think there was a sweetness to it, a reality. You know, it certainly didn't dodge any of the difficult, emotional and moral issues. But there was a kind of persistent sweetness of
Yeah, I think humanism, I think Mona's word humanism is exactly the right word and the well-chosen one. And when you think about it, after all, it's surprising that Peanuts will continue to be as popular as it is now, because you think of everything else around us that resembles it has none of its value. South Park, which has wonderful spirit and many brilliant things, which is a kind of contemporary Peanuts. In some ways, it's sort of a parody of Peanuts, in fact, the same big round heads and small children off in a universe of their own. But its impulses are completely satiric and parodic and subversive, and wonderfully so. But you would not describe it as a humanist masterpiece, South Park, at all.
even the Simpsons.
Yeah, no,
Same
exactly.
way, they're all sort of fueled completely by irony.
Exactly. And by irony and a kind of aggression and the opposite of sweetness in that way. But then what I think makes Peanuts endure, what makes it profound, to use the word I don't hesitate to use about it, is exactly that, like all great humanism, it's a combination of realism and hope. Because the thing, and Mona has a wonderful essay in this collection about one of the great love affairs in American letters, Lucy and Schroeder, and makes a smart point that it's really a triangle, Lucy Schroeder and his piano, and that's the question that's always being asked is, which do you, it's more like Sunday in the Park with George, right? Like finishing the hat, who do you love more, the piano or the woman, or Dot in that show. And I think that, as I say in my own piece, it's a kind of brutal truthfulness about it, that after all, the person who runs the psychiatric stand in Peanuts is the one person you would never want to treat you, is the most neurotic person in the entire world. And who's the one person who most needs psychiatric help is the person who's dispensing psychiatric help.
But isn't that like life?
You took the words out of my mouth. And that is exactly true. Every shrink I've ever known is a deeply troubled person who chooses to become a shrink because they haven't, most of us are able to work our problems out by going bowling or doing the Strand. They can't, so then they become therapists. It's that level of insight into the truths about human nature that I think buoys up the script and makes it as extraordinary as it is.
Well, it's funny that it could complement the two pieces of yours, or a paradox, because they're similar in some ways, because you each get into one of these themes, dominant themes of unrequited love. And Adam, you write, everyone loves the wrong person, as we all do in life. And Mona, you wrote, Peanuts is all about longing, and usually when Adam speaks, I need a dictionary. But I don't know if you used the word unrequited, unrequition? Is that how you say it, or is that over? It's dominating. We did an event at the New Yorker Festival, and what came up sort of interesting there, and I'd like to table here, is the sort of question of whether Peanuts is dark. Adam, you're clear, I think, right on the first page of your piece, you call it mordant, and I think I know where you come down on this. It's a little bit semantic about it, but I think it was Chris Ware who said, I don't think of it as dark, I think of it as real. And Mona, your point, maybe it was just there's just something so discomfiting or unusual about such reality in a comic strip coming out of children. And then the sort of companion point was, because so many people's experience is colored by and informed by the TV specials, that you hear those voices in your head. And there's just this disjunction between, as you said, the big heads, the small bodies, no parents, very little furniture. Do you think of it as depressing, as dark, or is it just real in a way that sort of sets itself apart from other comic strips?
Well, dark humor, even black humor, doesn't have to be depressing. Chekhov is incredibly dark, but it's not depressing exactly. We feel exhilarated when we go to one of his plays. Melancholic maybe, but we often feel melancholic after we read a great strip. Melancholic in the sense of recognizing the bittersweet truth of what's been said. But yes, I do think it's dark in the sense that, to repeat myself here, is this on actually?
Yeah.
Is it on?
No, it was before.
It wasn't. Is it on now?
Yeah.
Sorry. Isn't that the worst thing about it? Is it on? Is it?
Yes, exactly. Is it rolling, Bob? That's a reference. It's a reference you have to be of a certain generation to know. So dark, certainly, in the sense that the most neurotic person is the psychiatrist. The little redheaded girl, Charlie Brown, is never going to obtain. The most intelligent person in the strip by far is Linus. And Linus is the one who's most captive of a crazy cult, the cult of the Great Pumpkin, which not only is crazy on the face of it, but only he believes in. Right? So, when you do this monomaniacal Schroeder, and the fact that Lucy, who needs a healthy relationship, is in love with the one person in the strip who's least able to supply her with, as you point out, with what she desires. So it's certainly dark in that sense. In inventory, the relationships in it, they're all fundamentally unhappy, or jealous, or competitive, or not designed to give joy. But the effect of the strip, because in the time-honored way of comedy, because it is so truthful, because it's so recognizably psychologically right, is exhilarating rather than depressing.
And it's, when you think of it, we have only these children, and we never see the parents. And the parents aren't the factors in their lives. They will up and decide they're going to move, and so that'll happen. Things happen to them because they're parents, but they're helpless in certain ways. They don't have any agency in the greater world. And there's an extraordinary amount of frustration. You see frustration everywhere. And yet it's very funny. It is very funny. It's in a kind of existential way.
Yes, it's funny because actually when you asked me to write about it, Andrew, although I love the strip all through my childhood and all through my adult years too, it's a long time between actually sitting down. You obviously did that moment too. You actually sat down to read what the week do. And I had forgotten how many strips, especially in the late 50s and early 60s, begin with Charlie Brown saying to Linus, I'm so depressed.
Yes.
Or Linus, I'm really depressed. And I'm like, wow, you couldn't get away with that now, right? But that was a kind of a verbal tick of the period. Remember Holden Caulfield,
right,
who belongs to the same universe in some general way, always talks about being depressed. That's the term. I don't think we have clinical depression. But if someone says, I'm depressed,
we're not the age of depression anymore. We're the age of anxiety.
Well, Adam, you see Charlie Brown, as you say, as Holden Caulfield 6 or 7 years before he runs away from school.
Did I say that? That's right. I think there's some truth in that, because Charlie Brown has an acute sense of the phoniness of the grown-up world. He's prone to melancholia, and the world is always disappointing him. If you remember, that's true about Holden as well. Holden has very idealized expectations of friends, of New York City, of jazz clubs, of everything. He's always being disappointed by his experience. And Charlie Brown in the same way. The thing is, he doesn't understand that he plays for a losing baseball team. He thinks that if they actually would pull themselves together, that they would have a chance to win. So he's never fatalistic about it. It's the football is probably the most famous example in all of American literature.
It was Ronald Reagan's favorite trope of the whole strip, the football.
Yeah.
But it begs the question of whether it's Charlie Brown with the football or Linus and the pumpkin patch. Is the takeaway from it perseverance and conditional faith, or sort of more you're not pathologizing, but you're just sort of saying they're living in their own universe? Schultz was on record as saying, when people said, can't you let him kick the football once? He said, no, because it's not fun. It wouldn't be funny then. And he came up with 40 years worth of different ways to sort of lure us for some. Maybe we were deluded too. We're cockeyed in our optimism, but maybe this time. I just want to mention to you, mentioned Holden Caulfield. I made a little checklist of in your piece, Adam, you mentioned Chekhov 3 separate times, Beckett twice, Pascal, Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, Holden Caulfield, William Styron, Van Gogh, Andrew Wyatt, who
Well, that's because Snoopy collects
Snoopy has
Van
Van Gogh and Wyatt. And Schultz also talked about how he had a long time to believe that Schultz's insecurity and humility was authentic because he just couldn't take a compliment very well, and he would his sort of thesis statement sometimes would end up being, "Well, I'm not Andrew Wyatt."
Can I tell you a funny story about the Andrew Wyatt thing that tells you something about the crazy family I grew up in? Everybody read Peanuts. I have 6 brothers and sisters, and my parents were college profs from a simple background, and everybody read Peanuts. It was, I'm sure, it was the what's the word?
Was it syndicated in Canada?
Yeah, it was everywhere, and it was a mainstay. Everybody read it every day, and everybody talked about it and referenced it in all walks of life. If you remember, Snoopy's doghouse burns down, and he says, "Oh my God, my Van Gogh," and everybody's touching Charlie Brown. And then there's a subsequent strip in which everyone is inside the doghouse saying, "I like this picture quite a bit. I like this picture even more." And then you see Snoopy on top of the doghouse saying, "My new Andrew Wyatt is going over very well." My parents were modernists, and they were so shocked and disappointed that Snoopy had bought an Andrew Wyatt. He had lost his Van Gogh, but he hadn't bought a Jackson Pollock or a Rothko. He had bought an Andrew Wyatt, and they were genuinely pained by the idea that a second-rate realist would have taken the place of Van Gogh in Snoopy's. He admired him, I think.
He greatly admired him, and again, I had occasion.
What else did we
Question. It seemed as if he wasn't sure whether to consider himself. Sometimes he'd say, "I'm just a cartoonist." I'll go back to this story in a minute, but I had occasion to meet him and to get to know him a little bit, which I didn't realize how unusual that was until much later on. But I once, in our sort of pen pal correspondence after we spent some time together, I noticed one day that there's a Pulitzer Prize for cartooning, political cartooning. And I wrote to him and I said, "I think there should be one for who do what you do." And his response, it turns out, was very him, which is just, polite, thank you, but I just want to be left alone to do what I do. But I think if you offended him, I think Mona, in your piece, you write about the rejection he experienced at the beginning of his career, including Disney, I think, saying that he didn't have
The goods.
But just to back up and tell you that sort of origin story, in 1996, because I'm for the most part I'm a literary agent, so I represent writers in their books, and so I was representing this book called Our Mother's Spirits, which is an essay collection of men writing about their mothers and the grief of men. And I had seen an A&E biography, documentary about Schultz, who was notoriously reclusive, private. He spoke, he was always very stoic and reserved. And we got to the subject of talking about his mother, and that was a very close and relationship and a traumatic ending to it. Something struck me about how emotional he got. So I wrote to him out of the blue. I was telling this story to these two before, that it was 1996, before the internet, and my mother had always told the story that when she was in school, the prettiest girl in the class ever had a date on Saturday night. And why? Because all the guys thought that she was out of their league. So when I had the instinct to write to Charles Schultz, and I think a lot of people did, part of me said, what's the point? But then I think I heard my mother's voice in the back of my head, so I wrote this letter. It's a very long story. The upshot is I expected to get sort of a nice form letter. Instead, I got a personal letter back from Schultz, for some reason politely declining to write that book, but saying, if you ever find yourself in Santa Rosa, California, please stop by. I'd love to meet.
Wow.
And I thought, if this is a bluff, I'm calling you up. And I made a plan. It happened. My girlfriend at the time was a little redheaded girl, and we made a plan to go to Napa Valley. And it took a while, and there we were in his office. And I don't know, something about that always spoke to his vulnerability, sensitivity, accessibility. But back to your original question, other than Andrew Wyeth, I don't know.
You know, the other question, this is a great story too. This is like life lesson to teach our children, right? Always write to the people you admire, because they may write you back. You know,
Yes, exactly.
you can guilt trip them into
Might get
you might get in that too. Is it true? I remember it was, whose was it? David Moranis wrote the biography.
David McCandless.
David McCandless. Oh, David Moranis wrote the biography of Vince Lombardi, I think. So, right. It's close. Icons of the 60s. Schultz was a Christian, a devout churchgoer, was he not?
He was. I think you mentioned that he became sort of re-identified himself as a humanist, actually. But no, he was.
But still a church.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. And you write too about faith in the strip and.
Because I know this will sound like a slightly absurd comparison, but I don't think it is. You know, he comes of age as an artist at a time in American life when a certain kind of liberal Christianity, a certain kind of light Christianity, plays an enormous role in literature and the culture. The obvious parallel, cognate, is John Updike. Because Updike as well is simultaneously somebody who studies betrayal, adultery, every kind of misbehavior in social circle, but he spends his whole life as a devout Christian, and he sees that bearing witness to those things is not God is not bearing witness to a godless universe, but it's exactly the universe that God made. And I've often felt that. So I know a somewhat pompous way of putting it, but I feel that way about the strip. That it's from the point of view of a believer.
It's an interesting comparison of Updike and does anyone read the wonderful Patricia Lockwood essay in the London Review of Books on Updike? She starts it out by saying, whereas I was hired to be the assassin. Why else would you hire a 37-year-old woman to do John Updike? And she recounts how she tried for food. And it's actually a very long, it brings up his best qualities and his shortcomings. But I mean, it's funny even just listening to this anecdote about the prettiest girl in the high school. It's worth noting that even in this period when I think if you picked America's major writers, you could not find one who described men in the way he described women. I mean, I'm sure that the women were focused on primarily and initially, if not solely, on the basis of their appearance. There was no prettiest girl in Peanuts. There wasn't. People had their favorites, but it wasn't quite that. It wasn't the consumer culture we live in that way. And I think that's worth noting, because he was in the business.
There's the little red-haired girl who we don't see is meant to be.
We never see her, but she's meant to be his favorite. But it's not. I don't think she's meant to be the most beautiful. She's just the one he likes.
She's red-haired.
Early in your piece, didn't you write that the Schultz Museum, I think in 2011,
I
gave
know,
free
they-
admission
they-
to all redheaded girls
Yes.
on Valentine's Day?
I guess that's true.
And I think, again, Chris Ware, who's also in this book, talks about and writes about how he felt so connected to Charlie Brown. One of the revelations for me in this book, one of my apprehensions going in was that everybody was going to want to write about Snoopy.
I thought that.
And it was just a great surprise that Sally and Linus, but the amount of love and affection and sympathy for Charlie Brown is really touching. And so one of the people who was really moved by it was Chris Ware, who said he was so moved by it that he said, because there's this theme of Charlie Brown never getting a Valentine's card, and that he sent Charlie Brown, and it turns out he got a lot of them.
Schultz got a lot of Valentine's
Valentine's
Charlie
cards.
Brown.
That's right.
Yeah.
They sent-
Yes.
kids sent
That's
to-
amazing. Are they all in the museum, I wonder?
I'll be out there next month.
That would be a cool thing to see.
I'm just going to read a quote and see if this leads to sort of a pivot to something else. It's from Barack Obama. Like millions of Americans, I grew up with Peanuts, but I never outgrew it. Wherever I lived, wherever I traveled, I could find those 3 or 4 panels in the paper each morning. And Charlie, Snoopy, Linus, Lucy, Franklin, and the gang brought childhood rushing back. That's what made Charles Schulz so brilliant. He treated childhood with all the poignant and tender complexity it deserves. He gave voice to all its joys and anxieties, a spectrum of emotions that run from the start of a new baseball season to the anguished that comes with losing the big game. He explored the emotions that we too often forget kids feel until we're reminded that we've once felt them ourselves. Hope, doubt, the exquisite pain of unrequited love, the self-exploration of what it means to be different, the comfortable knowledge that it's all going to be okay, even if Lucy's advice isn't very good. For decades, Peanuts was our own daily security blanket. That's what makes it an American treasure. In his final strip, Schulz wondered how he could ever forget the Peanuts gang. The rest of us never will, and we can share our love for the gang with our children and grandchildren for decades to come. Isn't that beautiful?
Remember when we had
Trump
a
wrote
president?
that? Oh, the other president. Oh, the
Bill
He could
Clinton
write.
looked at Peanuts, I think it's
Can you imagine?
Reagan again had a sort of friendship, but Obama wrote that as part of an introduction for another book, and I just was so
That's
knocked out.
amazing.
So amazing.
That's amazing.
So
Can you
true.
imagine having a president who is that articulate, intelligent, insightful, and humane? Did that ever happen? Actually, in the
Well, it's
in-
funny, Schulz was I mean, this is ironic or surprising or neither, but Schulz was a lifelong Republican
Yeah.
per se,
Right.
and he told his son reports that one of Schulz's stated regrets in his life is that he didn't vote for Kennedy, despite being Republican.
he voted for Nixon, which is what that means. It's in that way. That's so.
That's interesting. I like that. It is interesting to sort of contrast that none of the kind of existential anguishes are missing from their lives, and yet it did have this quality of being a security blanket. So it's an interesting.
Yeah, it was, none of the existential crises are missing from our lives, right? Even
but,
from the.
but I wouldn't say, as much as I love Beckett, I wouldn't say that Beckett is a security blanket in that way.
It's true. No, it's true. It
There's something
finds a way of being completely charming about things that
Yeah.
are deeply disturbing.
and contextual.
Do either of you think that there's anything in the culture, given how polarized the culture is there anything that you can imagine that could have this kind of transcendent, universal, broad appeal?
Well, I think there was something that was, and that was the Muppets. Which were very similar sort of phenomenon. Jim Henson and the Muppets are very much like Charles Schulz and Peanuts. That was very much his own vision with Frank Oz's support and assistance. But it was very much his own vision. It was something made for kids that always appealed to adults. And where, again, the level of intelligence that was being invested in something that was totally out of proportion to what one expected from a puppeteer. And also in the same way that you should write Miss Piggy and Kermit next, right? Because it's a very similar kind of relationship, right? Where Miss Piggy worships Kermit in the same way that Lucy does Schroeder. But it had that kind of psychological acuity to it in the form, while remaining
Is there anything like that now? I
Well,
can't.
That's why I go back to where I started
None of
with
us
the
have,
Beatles.
you have the youngest child, but is there anything, my children are.
My child is sleeping, hopefully, right now, he's not 5 yet, but on a Snoopy pillowcase. I mean, admittedly, part of it is I have exposed him, I haven't voiced it up, but he also knows, it seems, every word to every Beatles song already.
Wow.
And it's just because my father exposed me to Sinatra. It's not a coincidence. How much of this is generational? How much are kids going to be oppositional if you sort of voice something on them, they're going to go the opposite direction? But then are there some things that are just always going to, for Adam, one of the anthologies I did was about the Bible, and Adam wrote the introduction to it. And it's the only one of these anthologies that I put together on a subject that I knew pretty much nothing about, but was keenly interested in. And in that case, as a secular Jewish person, I just became intrigued with sort of wondering what the relevance of the Bible is. And people have said that the Peanuts has sort of biblical
the parables of Peanuts. Remember
Yeah,
that was a
right.
successful book.
Well, the Gospel according to Peanuts, as of 20 years ago, had sold over 10 million copies.
But that was the connection. Is there anything? I'm just trying to think if maybe we're being unresourceful, but I can't think. My kids, of course, responded very much to.
It was Harry Potter, it was older.
Yes, but that's also more kind of, in a certain way, more traditional. You know,
Yeah.
an adventure story with kids in it. I think what you were saying a moment ago, Mona, is profoundly true. The things that they were took most pleasure in, The Simpsons, Family Guy, South Park, were satirical in first impulse. Not that that's remotely criticism of them, but that was sort of the things that that were their references. That's what they, although it's like yours, and again, maybe it was a bad atmosphere in the house, but mine were Beatles fans. They weren't fans of that, they just accepted the Beatles like the moon, just something in the world, rather than something that was made.
Well, but as long as we're on your family, there are some generation, how rabbis in your...
Oh, going back?
Going back?
On my mother's side, yeah.
Right.
It's like they're nothing but rabbis. They were too busy even to leave for the diaspora. They missed the bus to the diaspora. They stayed where they were.
Where were they?
In the Bronx, actually.
I'm just sort of remembering your introduction to the Bible book, you're talking about basically there are 4 different ways to read the Bible.
Yes, I did. Now that you've brought that back to me, I did. If I can remember what they were, we'd all be in better shape. Yes, I think there was a literal way, which is the way fundamentalists read it. Correct me if I'm help me here. An allegorical way, which is the way that more sophisticated believers read it. Narrative way, which is the way literary people tend to read it. And there was another way. Now I can't remember what the other way is, but I think that's true, and I think it's also true about Peanuts, obviously. And it's sort of miraculous that you can enter it at pretty much any of those levels. You can enter it as a series of parables about the mysteries of faith and the discontents of community, or you can enter it as by identifying with one. It's a miraculous piece of work of art.
Well, and it's, when you think of the structure too, I mean, you could basically pick it up, having never seen it, and enjoy that day's panel. And yet you could read it every day and not have incredible redundancies or contradictions. So, I mean, the narrative arcs he's keeping in the air are incredible over 50 years.
And they never
They
got
never
older.
grow up. That's the
There were changes, the introduction of Franklin, the first
Yeah.
black character.
And I love that story, how a woman a school teacher wrote to him a letter and said, well, we should have a black character, what about it? And he did. That's kind of incredible.
Not unfortunately a terribly memorable one. That's it's of all the characters in the script that was
Right.
at least well defined.
Well, I think he was careful. You know,
Not to get- yeah.
I mean, that's the thing. He was careful.
Not to load of anxiety.
Well, it's funny. When I met with Schultz, it was probably 25 years ago almost. I remember I asked him 2 questions, which, given that I had that audience, it was like meeting the Wizard of Oz. And I asked him what was Woodstock's gender. Which anytime I mention that to
That's
people,
funny.
everybody says, "What a silly thing! Of course it's a boy.
like
Of course it's a man." And I mean, the irony of this being now, everything's fluid, and I don't know. Maybe Woodstock. I went back through the script. I never saw anything that was manifest evidence that Woodstock was a boy bird. And then I asked him what was Franklin's last name, that everybody else basically seemed to have a last name. And the Van Pelt's in the ground. And he actually stopped and had the thing. He said, I don't know, maybe Jones. And I said, you don't know. And then, if you know, the postscript to this is there's a cartoonist, I think, named Rob Armstrong, who claims that, and I don't cast any aspersions on the claim, but he and Schultz got in touch, and I think in subsequent strips, somehow there was some mention that his name actually was Franklin Armstrong, and that he got the idea from talking to this guy, Rob Armstrong. I mean, Schultz was very, I was surprised, he was very complicated, and he was like a lot of us, though, in that the ideas had to come from his own mind. If somebody said, you know, you should do a strip of where Linus and Lucy, that was a surefire way that he was not going to do it.
I imagine that this syndicate must have tried to coax him into continuing the strip, arranging to continue the strip after his death. Because so many great American strips have been
I'm very glad
perpetuated.
you asked that, because
Yeah,
that's
that's a
something I
really
wanted
good
to talk back to the two of you. The strip continues to run. I mean, at its height, at its peak, I think it was being read by 350 million people in 75 countries and dozens of languages. It's still in the Washington Post every Sunday. It's still in a lot of newspapers, but obviously it's in syndication. I think he hasn't been alive for 20
Right.
years.
So they recycle.
So they recycle, which it's come up in another discussion, sort of the ethics of that. But given the precious real estate and that there are a lot of up-and-coming cartoonists, is there something wrong? But like, is that something as it should be, that we're sort of recycling?
Give other people a chance.
That's if it's a zero-sum game.
Nostalgia, yeah.
I mean, do you have a feeling about that?
I don't know, that's an interesting question. I'm certainly glad that they didn't get someone else to,
Continue.
Right. Well, sorry, I didn't answer that. He was always on record as saying that nobody else was ever.
right, and
Which
I,
I took for granted, but apparently other cartoonists have left it to somebody else.
yeah, I don't like that, but I don't know, I think that is an interesting claim that, but is it true that it's a zero sum? I'm not sure. I mean, I think that in a way the success of Peanuts probably has, I mean, I don't know, I happen to have one of my children who's now in his 20s, but he was an early adopter of all things graphic, all graphic novels, all kinds of contemporary, experimental cartoonists. And so I would sometimes, play parodies of the chauffeur, I would drive him to events, and as a literary novelist, I'd go to hear my favorite writer or something at a bookstore, and there'd be an audience, a small audience, and then you go to one of these venues where the new graphic novels, and literally being crews from Japan, I mean, the room would be filled with hundreds of people. So it's a very, very, very vibrant form right now, and kind of thrilling. And I don't know that necessarily if you took Peanuts out, it would make more room for new things, or if it would, saps. I think sometimes it just encourages more.
But that's a very interesting point, Mona. I hadn't thought about that. You talk about the graphic novel.
Well, that's very connected.
Right. I think it is right. I'm doing a profile of a well-known cartoonist right now for the New Yorker,
Which one?
and Ross Chast.
Oh, yeah.
And she was making the point that her life as a cartoonist was sort of divided in half by the appearance of graphic novels in the 1980s, and it was what gave her the confidence, not the inspiration, the confidence to do her wonderful graphic novel, Can't We Talk About Something More Pleasant,
Yeah.
which is a masterpiece, just great. But now that I think about it, so many of the things that we think of as being particular to the graphic novel, it's realism, it's willingness to take on unpleasant subject matter. Yes, exactly. Fun Home.
Yes.
Fun Home. There's a lot of
So many.
Peanuts in Fun Home. I had not thought about that before, but there's a lot of Peanuts in Fun Home. In the whole notion of having that semi-grotesque occupation that the kids are used to, in the way that the kids speak. They're both maturing kids. I never thought about that before, but there's actually a lot of Schultz in the graphic novel.
No, I think so, and that's just exploded. Although I think we haven't talked very much. I mean, we talked about his narratives and everything, that it's natural regardless, but just a narrative. But the genius of his economy of style is unsurpassed. I mean, I love so many things that come after it, and I love Japanese too. But I still think, I would love to own, a panel of Peanuts. I don't know that I'm dying to own, Kermit's costume or something. It's like,
He's an astoundingly
Just
unpretentious and
beautiful.
yet, yeah. Is there a secondary market in original Peanuts, or did he keep
oh,
it
I'm
all
sure.
in the drawings?
Yeah, I
Oh
think
my
so.
God, I
Yeah.
don't
Oh, for sure.
probably primary market.
Yeah, well, but Mona, you mentioned Chip Kidd in your piece, and he's actually,
He did a beautiful book as well.
he did the cover for this book as well. And he talks, as many people who know what they're talking about, when he sign talks about the economy of the States, and Nicole Burdick's piece that a lot of the blank space complements the reading. You know,
It's eloquent. The blank space is eloquent of the vision of the.
And when she wrote that, I went immediately in my mind to a piece that George Plimpton once wrote about playing right field. And that's where he wrote about how some of the greatest ideas in history have been concocted while in right field, because there just wasn't much going on.
So nothing happened in blank space. And
That's funny.
well, one of my favorite pieces in the book, as I think I mentioned, Andrew, is the Gerald Early's piece about the use of cool jazz in the Peanuts cartoons, which is one of those rare cases where two things are perfectly mated. If I hadn't lost it before, the composer, Vince Guaraldi. His music is so ideal, and it was one of those great pieces of good fortune, because I imagine that it could have so easily, those Charlie Brown's Christmas could have been matched with any kind of popular or generic music of that time. And the match of that sound, as he says, is exactly right. You could say it's sort of organic because it's California jazz, is basically what it is, and Schultz is a California writer, though we don't often think of him that way.
Whatever it says, and I don't know what it says. I didn't grow up loving cartoons, and this was my favorite. This was the only one.
Yes.
And it's an embarrassing admission, but I'm not into jazz. I'm sorry, but I love that soundtrack, and it's my Peter Pan's my happy place. It's where I go to place. It's not just Christmas time. It'd be the middle of summer.
Yeah, that's a good
Do we have any questions? Yes.
When you were reading President Obama's description of Charlie Brown, and then you were talking about something that persists, I thought back to my own childhood and thought of Mr. Rogers and like a lot of the parallels there. He was also like a devout Christian, a lifelong Republican, and he very much thought of children as intelligent and emotional beings. And when I like rewatched some of his clips on YouTube, it was like the 20-something-year-old, I like cry because it's so sophisticated.
Did you see that wonderful documentary about him?
I watched it with my mother, and both of us were very like we were a captive audience, and like as an immigrant child, like that's how we learned to speak English, and it like and like that aspect of it, and like the emotional like sincerity, and when you're talking about Peanuts, like I feel like a lot of the same goosebumps thinking about the book.
That's a great point, and it's mentioned a couple of times in the book, and I'm glad you brought it up so we can get into that, because
The only thing I'd add is, because it's fascinating to say that, because it reminds us there was a time when popular culture directed towards children was fundamentally humane, and was a celebration of humane values instead of violence. But at the same time, I would add, though, that what makes Schultz remarkable even within that world is that it has a satiric edge, which Mr. Rogers did not have a sharp satiric edge in the neighborhood for the most part.
isn't Tom Hanks playing in
Yes, he
Yeah.
plays brilliantly. I haven't seen it, but I'm told it's great.
I really love Peanuts as well. And one of the things I really liked about it, though, was that there was a character called Marcy. And my name is Marcy, and I never knew anybody named Marcy. And not only that, never spelled my name correctly. Ever. So I was
So
imagining
Marcy is Peppermint Patty's
best friend.
aide de camp, right?
But about, I don't know, I'm into a lot of memorabilia for many years, before eBay and all that, and I was looking up about the Marcy character, and I was shocked to read that she was considered to be a lesbian. I
Yes.
had no idea. And I just wondered now, 50 years later and 40 years later, would his characterization, whether it's Franklin or Marcy or some of the others, would it have to conform differently to what is acceptable now?
It's funny, I was wondering, I have two, writers get galleys and two giveaways and two one collection of short stories, one novel. I have right now on my desk are what the editor said, it's, the novels by men and a white man. So every novel now by a white man is about a crisis in the crisis in masculinity. I was wondering how we would view the masculinity crisis.
Well, it's funny.
They're sensitive men,
Yeah. It's funny because the Peppermint Patty thing is really kind of fascinating.
Yeah.
Because as long as I can remember, back when we were kids, and for the first time, gay novels were beginning to
Yeah.
appear in lesbian novels too. And Peppermint Patty was a steady reference, right?
Right.
The first time, it was not uncommon for a young lesbian novelist. The first time I felt that there was an outward expression of my inner state was when I saw Peppermint Patty in Peanuts. I'm sure that Schultz didn't intend it to be specifically of that kind, but it's a sign of his.
You know that? Maybe he did.
I don't know, but it's certainly a sign. It doesn't have to be just a sign of the inside of his empathy that he recognized that the kind of girl that Charlie Brown would have met at summer camp would have had those traits and would have had the devotion of Marcy so it's nice that it comes very much out of the his perception of humanity, not necessarily out of a particular purpose.
It is devotion. It's a great word for it. She is devoted to her. It's on the continuum, but it's not at the end of that spectrum of unconditional, unrequited love. Jennifer Finney Boylan has a piece in the book where she sort of writes about outsiders, and the title of her piece is "You're Weird, Sir." And because if you remember, Marcy always referred to Peppermint Patty as "Sir," which I don't know. I'd have to ask David Michaelis or go back and look more closely whether there's anything sort of more manifest than that sort of is, goes one way or the other. So, good question.
Is there a writer in the book that touches on, I think you alluded to it earlier about how Snoopy was kind of, a lot of people think he took over the strip around the 70s and 80s.
Yep.
And even, of course, it's one of the great ironies that I've read that Charles Schultz hated Peanuts, which even I cringe.
The name.
Right, I cringe.
Yeah.
I've never referred to the strip as Peanuts. Even when I got a shirt saying, it's always Snoopy to me. But I wonder if there's anybody in the book that alludes to, there's a lot of people who think that Snoopy just took over and just.
I mean, I'll just quickly say that in addition to sort of being surprised at how much love there is for Charlie Brown, I was, on the other hand, surprised at how much, not so much in the book, but just out there about, that Snoopy's a narcissist. And,
That's funny.
I mean, you Adam in particular, write a lot about sort of, or talk well about sort of, he's the only one who, when he's talking about Chekhov, I mean, he's the only one who's not in prison.
He's the only one with an intense inner life.
And Rhoda, you mentioned he's the only one whose parents we ever see in the strip.
Yes.
Yes, that's true.
Yes, that's right.
This is true. But he has an intense and largely well-integrated inner life. His
Yeah.
fantasies are productive for him. He's a writer.
Well, he has his acting.
Well,
Yes,
Ann Patchett has a piece in the book basically describing her career as a writer to
It was a dark and stormy night.
But I mean, it's on record that sort of, I think people, again, are experts on this, that when Snoopy got up on his feet, because initially he was just a dog on four legs, that when Schultz put him onto that changed the strip, whether it was for better or for worse, that in turning the doghouse on its side to give us the view that we got this initially. So,
It's fun. No, it's strange to think about that. But I think
Yeah.
it's so interesting, though, about the title, because it is a terrible title for a great work of art,
Yeah.
Peanuts. And I'm right, it's not his title.
not at all.
No,
It's
it's definitely doesn't. Although his original title wasn't so great either.
Little
Little
Folks.
Little Folks.
L-I-L.
Little
Not even
Folks.
little.
It's a terrible.
And
Little.
Peanuts
I
came
think his
from
is just as bad, to be honest.
that How Do You Do show. They had the Peanut Gallery, I think, and that's sort of.
I think it originally, like in his office, before he actually before it was syndicated and all, he had it as Sparky to Little Folks. So I like Sparky. I like that name so much.
I remember on Sundays it would always be, and I always assumed it was his way of remedying it. It would always say Peanuts featuring good old Charlie
Good old
Brown.
Charlie
Yeah.
Brown.
And I'd always assumed that he really wanted to change the name
He
of the
did.
strip to Charlie
Yeah.
Brown.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And they just couldn't have it.
Your name is Marcy, my name is Lucy. And I often call myself the Dark Hair Plus Budget. I want to know. I actually interviewed the musician who took over after Dick Scaraldi passed away, who now does the music for the Peanut specials. And I asked him, did the word fuss budget, did Charles Schultz coin
Originate
the
that
word,
word.
or did it exist as a word before that became popularized by the strip? Does anybody know?
You know, this is one of those good things that as my daughter would say right now, she'd already have Googled this as you were
I know we
speaking,
can
right?
find that out.
And I'm sure we could find out.
Yeah, I didn't have a chance to do it either, but I
It's a
just was
great
curious if
book.
anybody happened to know that.
I don't happen to know that. I happen to know from Adam's reference piece of good grief, which I thought Schultz invented an expression which was of a piece with his in curse. He called curse words ugly words. But that he didn't coin good grief, that's something that existed before.
I did the hard research work of Googling it and found out that it was not true. But that would be fun. I would bet a little bit of money that it was, again, a pre-existing word that he seized on and made a...
Right.
I guess so too, but I was just curious.
I was wondering before the peanuts whether there have been any other animals that like Snoopy in American culture. And I was also wondering, why do you think that Schultz gives Snoopy such a vivid inner life? I thought he was the most courageous and imaginative one. He's my favorite.
Well, he's clearly the most courageous and imaginative one, but he's also the locked-in one. He can't talk. He can't speak, right? He doesn't, he can type. And Charlie Brown has some empathetic understanding of how gifted he is, but he doesn't get rewarded like all writers. He doesn't get rewards commensurate with his gifts. He's in that, locked in that way. I'm old enough to remember, and God forgive me for starting a sentence that way, when the Snoopy and the Red Baron was a genuine phenomenon in the mid-'60s, when that series of scripts was rising to the height. There was a big pop song hit about it, and it was really, it wasn't just popular, it was manic popular. You know, it was really above all. I tend to agree with this gentleman, though, as loving the strip, though I do think that in the last, that if we, like everything else, even things that are hugely protean and rich, the novels of P.G. Wodehouse do have a high period. For me, the high period of Peanuts is from 1958 until 1973, right through the 60s. And I did feel that in the last 10 years or so, that sort of Snoopy gag strips with Snoopy sort of took over the world a little bit more than one would have wanted. It lost some of its...
And, I mean, when you think of it, I mean, one of the great things about our time is that we had a lot of writers who kept writing until very, very old age. You know, we had William Trevor, who wrote until he died. Alison Blow, who stopped, shortly, in very late age, she's alive still. So they wrote in their 80s, so you got this view of life in their 80s. But Schultz is writing about kids, and he's drawing and writing kids. He keeps on doing kids. So in a way, the wisdom he gained from being older, it's probably less district.
Well, I'll just seize on that just to bring up something some of you may know, which is that Schultz was always on record as saying, as exemplified by his response to my question of the Pulitzer for Junie, he just wanted to be left alone, do his work, do the script. He always said that anything that he had to say, he said through the script and through his characters. He was the script was him. He fell into bad health, announced he was going to stop the strip, and again, some of you may know, within 24 hours of the day that the strip was going to end, he died. And people thought at the time in 2000 that there really was, even if you were sort of a cynic, that there was something comic.
Well, but he was also, he didn't want a bigger, different form. I mean, there's that analogy with the piano that at one point he's given, he's always playing on Schroeder's always playing on a toy piano, but at one point he's given a real piano. Because Charlie Brown thinks, wouldn't it be great? What could if you could do this on a toy piano, what can you do on a real piano? Of course, on a real piano he completely freezes. And then he's eventually given back his toy piano and he's virtuosic again. So
he was playing, Schultz was the total mastery of, in some sense,
and that's what he wanted
a
to do.
limited keyboard.
Yeah.
This is true.
But he self-selected the limited keyboard.
Did he end his life as an insanely wealthy man or merely as a rather wealthy man?
pretty well for that.
You could define your terms, but I think,
World, what, 75 languages?
Yeah, I would think.
I think it was in the tens of millions
Plus
each
those
year.
TV things.
I was not being envious, but I was, you know.
I love that, at least tons of
Yes.
Was it a difficult process to get to agree to first?
As a
That's a good question.
was it difficult to get
Get into the
Schultz
process to get in.
to
Since
agree
the first
to do
cartoon,
the?
how was it?
The movie.
Oh,
the movie.
is that what you're
Yeah.
referring to? I think the Peanuts
And he
movie.
was he was active on the set and everything, right?
Yeah, I confess ignorance on
Yes,
that.
the set.
No, it's, I think there's, again, I think a lot of people's, entry point for Peanuts was the TV specialist, but, and I'm sure, I imagine there's some great story about it. I know it was written very quickly, and I don't think that the ratings initially, I don't know. It's again, as Adam said, it's something we can all look up.
But then we have Linda was saying that that whole portion was Christmas. Linda was telling me agonized over days how to explain what Christmas. And we find that so that we find Linus so
From-
just agonizing how to explain what.
From the Gospel of Luke, when that's, yes, that's.
No, I'm asking the probably I don't understand magic. Oh, anytime a writer has something to say, right? The screenwrites and stuff like that, you start fighting and say, hey, that's not what I want. So I'm just wondering what it was like.
I did read in his biography that it was a good experience.
Oh,
That he liked it.
The voices were wonderful.
They were wonderful.
It was-
I think it turned out I think it's like it's another example. It's just 5 feet from sentimental. It's not. It never is sentimental, but it's pretty darn close. And that takes an immense courage. from
But
artists.
coming back to this gentleman's point, and it references something we were talking about earlier, the takeaway of Charlie Brown's Christmas, unlike the takeaway of Frosty the Snowman or
Yeah.
Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, is explicitly Christian. It's what
Yes.
is the meaning of Christmas? It's the beginning of the Nativity story from the Gospel according to Luke. It's quite explicit in that way. Almost audacious if you compare it with the other, beloved
Yeah.
Christmas specials, which have almost no religious or even spiritual content. Rudolph gets when he ends up with kissing the girl.
The
he's
reindeer?
expecting- Yes, Clarice. Clarice, thank
The
you,
reindeer
thank you.
kisses the kingdom?
Yes, thank you, exactly. That's, and Burl Ives gets off the blacklist, so that's no small thing.
The only story that I actually have about the Christmas TV special, it's in the public domain, but I watched it faithfully. At one point years ago, it switched from being, I think, initially the CBS to ABC, or maybe the other way around. And I'm watching it, and it's almost like you see someone who say, you've done something different, your hair, your glasses, something was off, something was different, because I knew it like the back of my hand. And I couldn't figure out, and what it was, is whichever network bought the rights, paid so much for it, they had to get another ad in it. So they didn't cut it, they sped it up. So that they, when
They
it-
also
yeah.
edited though, initially they edited out Shermie's line about being a shepherd, and they also initially they edited out the scene where Snoopy's got the pile of bones and he's going through them. And I know I was bananas over it, and I think there was an outcry, and now subsequently
And now
it's
all
back.
restored.
It's
And
back.
it's back to the original
The
speed.
original speed and the original.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
I know, because what we're confessing ignorance. Who are the authors of You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown?
Yeah.
It's bizarre. You asked. I wouldn't swear to. Well, yeah, we can look at. I think. Well, how do I say this? My family and I have a house in Connecticut, and we just got a letter, like in our mailbox, not sent through the mail. Somebody saying, well, sort of welcome to the neighborhood. People who used to live on our block wrote.
You're a Good
One
Man.
of them wrote, I think maybe David Gessner. That would be a name.
I don't think they were names that like Martin Charney, but people who then
I don't-
went on to do more.
I don't think so, but I would test it on. Anyone else? Okay, Thank you very much.